Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ansakir Kopp, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 14 running back rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 14. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 36 ranked running backs. If you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, travel down to the description. We have timestamps available there, like in every single video. While you're down there, if you haven't yet already, be sure to subscribe and of course click the bell notification button. I'll be live later tonight like I am every single day on the channel, starting at 7 p.m. PST. If you have any questions regarding waiver wire or starter sit questions going into Week 14, I'm more than happy to help. Swing on by. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about running back rushing statistics allowed between weeks 6 through 13 as of late. Based on the overall contributions of running backs against these individual defenses, we have found that the New Orleans Saints, the Giants, Panthers, 49ers, Jaguars, Colts, Cowboys, etc. are the most advantageous matchups based on rushing statistics allowed, rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. Therefore, we want to start our running backs against these matchups because anything they do in the receiving game is purely categorized as something that the offensive coordinator or the quarterback is responsible for. Therefore, when we talk about matchups going into the given week, of course, Tyrone Tracy, Alvin Kamara have incredible matchup going into this week. Saquon Barkley, as if he needed an advantageous matchup, takes on the Carolina Panthers this week. Either way, we want to fire up our running backs in these advantageous matchups going into the week, while we also might want to avoid, facing some of the more disadvantageous matchups, such as the Philadelphia Eagles, the Lions, the Chiefs. Again, the Chiefs, of course, have stopped every single running back. Unless a running back scores a touchdown against the Chiefs, not a single running back who has yet to score a touchdown this year has eclipsed 10 fantasy points in a half PPR against them. Therefore, going into this week's matchup, Gus Edwards has not looked great as the starting running back of this offense. It is more of a running back by committee situation that is beginning to build in the absence of J.K. Dobbins. Again, we wouldn't expect much within the upcoming matchup. Therefore, I wanted to just go ahead and present this. We'll talk about this in more detail as we progress into talking about each individual running back, which we'll get into right now. But before I do so, a reminder for those of you who want to get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, and of course tail the upcoming underdog plays that we make every Monday, Thursday, and of course Friday with the Hidden Gems episodes, be sure to travel down to the description and check out Underdog. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you be able to claim the first time deposit offer, but like I said, you'll get my rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 14 through 18. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, includes flex to help you set your lineups every single Sunday morning. So for those of you interested, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. If in fact you are not eligible based on your current location, or if you've used my code or somebody else's code in the past, you can always check out the Patreon link down in the description where you can find rankings every single Thursday and Sunday, and of course, get unlimited questions answered. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about the running back position in regards to our top 36, with our number one, which of course is going to be Saquon Barkley. As if he didn't need an advantageous matchup like we mentioned earlier, he takes on the Carolina Panthers this week, the third best at the position, allowing over 20 fantasy points per game on the ground alone, are allowing 5.35 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs since week 6. Of course, the Carolina Panthers cannot stop the run. Most recently, they have allowed 168 rushing yards to New Orleans Saints running backs, 143 and a touchdown to New York Giants, 85 to Kansas City, and 228 rushing yards and a touchdown, most recently to, of course, Rachaad White and Bucky Irving's overall efforts. Therefore, Saquon Barkley going into the matchup should have himself an incredible game. Of course, he just needs to continue to average 100 rushing yards per game for the remainder of the season in order to eclipse 2,000 rushing yards on the season. Number two, the thumbnail of today's episode, we have Alvin Kamara, who going into the remainder of the season is going to highly benefit from the absence of Taysom Hill. Of course, we all know that there's a unfortunate season-ending injury that, of course, Taysom Hill sustained against the LA Rams this most recent Sunday. But going forward, Alvin Kamara should be able to take over this offense and purely score everything out of this backfield. There will no longer be a risk and or threat of Taysom Hill coming in to the overall equation and stealing value. Over the course of the last 4 games since the return of Derek Carr, Alvin Kamara's touches have consisted of 35, 22, 20, and 27. The volume of opportunity is there, and now that he has the entire workload of opportunity against the New York Giants, the second best matchup at the position, allowing over 20 fantasy points per game, 5.12 yards per carry on average since week 6 to opposing running backs. Again, the running backs that have taken on the New York Giants over the course of the last month of the season, last 4 games, the Giants have allowed over 110 rushing yards and 1 touchdown minimum to each backfield that they have faced. Alvin Kamara this week should be a fantastic play, especially considering the absence of Taysom Hill. Number 3, we have Bijan Robinson, who continues to elevate his game and be highly efficient and highly effective. Over the course of 5 of the last 6 games, he has totaled 100 plus yards. On top of that, has scored 18 plus fantasy points in 5 of the last 6 games. As long as he continues to play as well as he has. Taking on the Minnesota Vikings this week typically is not an advantageous matchup, specifically on the ground. But considering what Bijan Robinson has been able to do within the receiving game as of late, specifically in the last 5 games, averaging 5.4 receptions per game, that is a ridiculous statistic. I'm anticipating Bijan Robinson to find success, especially considering the Cardinals last week against the Minnesota Vikings totaled 100 yards on the ground. I expect Bijan Robinson to pick up exactly where he left off last week and exactly where the Cardinals left off in terms of their rushing efforts against the Minnesota Vikings finding success. The only variable that we're worried about is Kirk Cousins in the revenge game. Sure, he takes on his former team, but is he going to show up or is he going to throw picks and potentially hurt the overall value of all the receiving threats of this offense, including Bijan Robinson? Moving on to our number 4, we have Achane. So, taking on the New York Jets has obviously been quite the experience for teams as of late. The New York Jets cannot buy a victory as of late. But when we talk about Achane taking on this defense, I mean, they're the 11th best matchup, 15.44 fantasy points per game allowed on the ground alone. But where Achane really separates himself from other running backs is his receiving upside. Over the course of the last 8 games with Tua Tagovailoa, he's averaging 6 receptions per game and is number 1 amongst all running backs in the National Football League thus far this season because of these efforts with 6 receiving touchdowns. He's coming off of 7 of the last 8 games with 17 plus fantasy points, as long as Tua Tagovailoa is under center. Again, with Tua this season, averaging 19.95 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. So regardless of the matchup on the ground, he's going to succeed in the receiving game. And because of that overall factor, he's obviously a top 5 option going into the week. Now, another running back that is going to succeed in the same overall format, whether it is on the ground or through the air, is Chase Brown. Taking on the Dallas Cowboys, of course, is a top 7 matchup, the 7th best, 17.4 fantasy points per game allowed, 4.56 yards per carry on average allowed since week 6. Chase Brown should continue to find his success, considering again the volume of opportunity he continues to get. Even though we did see some sprinkles of Khalil Herbert this most recent game, the fact of the matter is Chase Brown has taken over each of the last 4 games, consisting of 16.8 or more fantasy points in a half PPR. Again, over the course of the last month, in the absence of Zach Moss, averaging 19.1 fantasy points per game in a half PPR, he has scored 8 touchdowns in the last 9 games. And as long as this offense continues to be as high powered as they are, Chase Brown will continue to succeed for fantasy purposes. Number 6, to begin the A tier, we have Josh Jacobs, who takes on the Detroit Lions on a short week this upcoming Thursday. Now, it's going to be in Detroit, a controlled weather environment. Last time these two teams took each other on, it was in Green Bay. It was a pretty sloppy game in terms of the overall weather. It was a heavy rain experience. But in that game, Josh Jacobs against the Detroit Lions in week 9, 13 carries for 95 yards. And if it wasn't for the fact that Emmanuel Wilson came into the game late and stole a rushing touchdown because Josh Jacobs had got a little bit banged up, he would have easily had himself 18 plus fantasy points within the overall contest. Luckily for him, as of late, he's been able to score these touchdowns and find himself consistent success on the ground, specifically getting himself 8 consecutive games of 90 or more total yards, coming off of his most recent game in which he wasn't able to find himself a lot of success on the ground, only 43 rushing yards on 19 carries, but was able to carry his overall week with a rushing touchdown and 4 receptions for 74 receiving yards. This is a 3-down back that is capable of succeeding regardless of the situation. Even though they do take on the Lions, which is the second most difficult matchup at the position, the Lions have only allowed 39, 35, 30, 57 rushing yards in the last 4 games to opposing backfields. The most recent game against the Green Bay Packers, they allowed 136 rushing yards to Green Bay Packers running backs. I would expect Josh Jacobs to pick up where he left off last time out against the Detroit Lions. Moving on to our number 7, we have Bucky Irving, who continues to play better and better every single week, getting himself more and more opportunity, coming off of a season-high 28 touches this most recent week against the Carolina Panthers, and now has potentially more of the same going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, which is, in my opinion, an advantageous matchup, primarily because if the Raiders' offense is going to falter, it's going to continue to allow this positive game script to lend the ball in the direction of Bucky Irving to continue to tote the rock and of course find success within the running game. And there's no surprise that they continue to give him more and more touches every single week. Over the course of the last 3 games, he is averaging 6.26 yards per carry and 4.96 yards after contact per attempt. Elite numbers across the board. He has scored a singular touchdown in each of the last 3 consecutive games. Like I mentioned earlier, if the Raiders offense isn't able to show up and show out, it's going to force a very positive game script in the direction of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where they'll continue to run the ball, whether it's with Bucky Irving or Rachaad White. I mean, the fact that Rachaad White comes in keeps Bucky Irving fresh, especially if they're going to continue to give him potentially 15 plus to 20 plus touches within these upcoming contests. Moving on to our number 8, we have Jahmyr Gibbs, who's coming off of a performance that was quite lackluster because of the lack of opportunity. 9 rushing attempts is not going to cut it in the case of Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, in the second drive of the game, Jahmyr Gibbs was featured, and he had 5 carries for 52 rushing yards. But then for the remainder of the game, only had 4 rushing attempts, which doesn't make any sense. Really, it's just a matter of them continuing to give the ball in the direction of David Montgomery. If that's going to continue to be the case, we all thought that last week on Thursday in that morning matchup, coming off of the injury in week 12 against the Colts, could have potentially, lend to more opportunities going in the direction of Jahmyr Gibbs. That was not the case, as David Montgomery left with 21 total attempts by the end of that game. Nonetheless, Jahmyr Gibbs has been highly efficient over the course of his career, specifically in 6 of the last 7 games, totaling 99 or more total yards. Again, last time out against the Green Bay Packers in week 9, 11 carries for 65 and a touchdown, 14.1 fantasy points. We're hoping for more of that overall production and opportunity share going into the given week. Moving on to our number 9, we have James Cook taking on the Los Angeles Rams, who have proven over the course of the last 2 weeks that they purely cannot stop the run. The Rams are allowing 13.66 fantasy points per game, 4.6 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. As of late, running backs, New England 93 on the ground, Philadelphia, of course, a ridiculous game of 277 on the ground, and in New Orleans, 112 on the ground from their running backs, not including any Taysom Hill rushing yardage, etc. James Cook this week, who of course has been saved by touchdowns as of late, will have an opportunity to get himself a bunch of yardage and hopefully once again score more touchdowns. He has scored 12 touchdowns in the last 10 games, which really has been the difference as to where he was this time last year in comparison to where he is this season as an automatic start every single week. If the Rams offense is in a very similar situation in which they were this most recent week, again, they scored 0 points in the first half of the game against the New Orleans Saints. If they get shut out like that against the Buffalo Bills, it's going to be over. The Bills will boat race them out of the building and get into a situation in which James Cook is running out the clock and finding a lot of success within the second half and finding a lot of success within the rushing category for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 10 to close out the 8 tier, we have Tony Pollard. Look, Tony Pollard last week had an experience that, again, didn't feature a lot of overall touches, only 12 within the game, but ultimately, when you're taking on the, Washington Commanders and you're losing 21-0 by the end of the first quarter, it's obviously not going to lend to more rushing opportunities. But this week they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are the 5th best matchup at the position, allowing 4.6 yards per carry, but not only that, 19 fantasy points per game on the ground. Most recently, they have allowed over 100 rushing yards to each of the last 5 teams that they have taken on. Green Bay 148, 2 touchdowns. Philadelphia 168 and a touchdown. Minnesota 144. Detroit 174, 3 touchdowns. And Houston 101 and a touchdown. Tony Pollard should be in line to succeed, especially considering this most recent performance was the least amount of touches and snaps that Tyjae Spears has experienced all season long in games in which he has been healthy. Only 14 snaps and only 1 singular touch. Therefore, Tony Pollard seems to have taken over this backfield entirely. Number 11, we have David Montgomery, who, as we all know, is pretty much 70 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown guaranteed on average. Now, unfortunately, this most recent week did not score a touchdown despite the fact that he had 21 rushing attempts for 88 rushing yards. But the fact of the matter is, going forward, he's expected to score a touchdown because typically they give him the opportunities to do so. If it wasn't for the fact that Sam Laporta's 2 receiving touchdowns this most recent game against the Chicago Bears, both of them existed inside the 5-yard line. If those didn't exist, they should have honestly been rushing attempts that led to David Montgomery scoring. Nonetheless, we'll accept it and hopefully find David Montgomery in the end zone this week as he takes on the Green Bay Packers. Last time out against that defense, 17 carries for 73, 11.1 fantasy points as a total. Luckily for David Montgomery, even though at times he doesn't score touchdowns, he has been highly efficient within the receiving game. He has got himself 3+ receptions in 4 of the last 5 games, which again, he is able to out-target and out-produce Jahmyr Gibbs within the receiving game as of late, considering he is getting more opportunity within that circumstance. Moving on to our number 12, we have Kyren Williams taking on the Buffalo Bills. Again, like I mentioned earlier, if the LA Rams come out and play as lackluster as they did most recently against the Saints, against a team like the Buffalo Bills, they are going to get blown out. And in that event, Kyren Williams will probably be finding garbage time or completely irrelevant within the overall matchup because they'll have to abandon the running game. But luckily, this most recent week, of course, the New Orleans Saints offense wasn't able to break apart and find themselves a huge lead. Therefore, it led to Kyren Williams in the second half cooking. Just to put it into perspective, Kyren Williams didn't have a single rushing attempt until 10 minutes and 27 seconds in the second quarter. Again, it took a while for him to give him the ball. But not only that, we saw a lot of Blake Corum this last week. 32% of the snaps out of the backfield played by Blake Corum. If we're going to see more and more Corum going forward, obviously it's going to impact Kyren Williams' overall upside. That is why I've lowered him to the number 12 spot, even though the Bills are an advantageous matchup, allowing over 12 fantasy points per game, 4.8 yards per carry, have allowed over 100 rushing yards to San Francisco, Indianapolis, and Miami as of late. We would anticipate that Kyren Williams is purely going to be, reliant on whether or not this is going to be a positive or negative game script going into the week. Hopefully, the LA Rams defense can keep this as a close one within the upcoming contest. Moving on to our number 13, we have Kenneth Walker. Look, Kenneth Walker is going to get himself 16, 18, potentially 20 plus touches every single game. Coming off of the last 2 weeks in which he is getting a healthy volume of opportunity, it's just purely a matter of can he score touchdowns, which as of late he has not been able to do. Unfortunately, this most recent week, Charbonnet had the rushing touchdown. It was a 2-back set. They motioned Kenneth Walker and, lined up as the fullback. Charbonnet takes the handoff and scores. Again, these are situations that are going to occur. Luckily, this week, he takes on the Arizona Cardinals, who he most recently, against them, 16 carries for 41, 4 receptions, 52. Again, a lot of his overall production saved by his receiving upside. If that doesn't exist, we're going to have a very similar week, just like this last performance against the New York Jets, in which he only finishes with 5.6 fantasy points. We need receiving upside and we need touchdown upside. In the absence of those two things, his inefficiency as a runner, considering this offensive line, the center retired, a lot of injuries have taken place across the board. With all of that inefficiency within the running game, if Kenneth Walker isn't able to find himself the receiving utilization and touchdowns that we need against Arizona, it could be a rough week. Speaking of Arizona, we have James Conner as our number 14, taking on Seattle. Last time out in week 12 against his defense, 7 carries for 8 yards, 5 catches, 41, and 7.4 fantasy points. Now, in that most recent performance against the Seattle Seahawks in week 12, it was the worst offensive performance that the Arizona Cardinals put up in the last 2 months of the season. Specifically within third down conversions, they were 3 for 12. So if Kyler Murray in the passing attack isn't able to find themselves success, of course, they're going to have to abandon the running game, which they did in that game, only giving James Conner 7 total attempts. In comparison to this most recent performance against the Minnesota Vikings, even though it was a difficult matchup, 17 carries for 68 yards, 3 receptions for 13 yards. Again, 20 total touches. That's the volume of opportunity I expect to see this week, especially taking on the Seattle Seahawks, who are allowing over 13 fantasy points per game on the ground and nearly 5 yards per carry to opposing running backs since week 6. Moving on to our number 15 to close out the B tier, we have Isaac Guerendo. Like I have mentioned, if he is available in your league, you are emptying the fab clip. This is a player that could potentially win you your 2024 Fantasy Football Championship because of the injury stints of Christian McCaffrey and now Jordan Mason. In the absence of these players, again, you got to remember, Isaac Guerendo is going to be exposed to a great volume of opportunity. In the first 12 games of the season for the San Francisco 49ers, their running backs are averaging 21 attempts per game and 3.3 targets per game. In the 2 games this season in which Isaac Guerendo has stepped in once Jordan Mason has gone down with injury, 24 attempts for 184 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown, a 7.67 yard per carry average in week 6 and 8 combined. Taking on the Bears is a top 10 matchup, allowing over 5 yards per carry to opposing running backs. The most recent performances against the Bears' run-stop defense, New England went for 120, Green Bay 93 in a touchdown, Minnesota 125 in a touchdown, and Detroit most recently 175 yards on the ground. The expectation is a lot of success for Isaac Guerendo within the upcoming matchup. Moving on to our number 16, we have Rico Dowdle, who is coming off of back-to-back performances of 20-plus touches. And as long as his offense continues to commit to Rico Dowdle, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, a defense that cannot stop a soul across the board, should be an advantageous matchup within the upcoming week. Again, they're allowing over 13.5 fantasy points per game on the ground to opposing running backs, which entirely excludes any receiving upside that Rico Dowdle will be exposed to, which over the course of the season, he has found himself success within that category. Recently, rushing attacks against the Cincinnati Bengals have consisted of the Pittsburgh Steelers, 100 and a touchdown on the ground, Los Angeles Chargers, 84, 2 touchdowns, and the Baltimore Ravens, 66 and 2 touchdowns. As long as Rico Dowdle finds himself in the end zone, he's a guaranteed top 17 option within the running back position. If he gets more receiving utilization, he'll potentially even get himself into the top 12 conversation by the end of the week against the Cincinnati Bengals. Moving on to our number 17, we have Breece Hall, who's coming off of another classic week of 1 target. Now, it wasn't because the New York Jets have completely ignored their running backs within the receiving game. It's because they've ignored primarily Breece Hall, as guys like Davis and Allen got themselves into situations in this backfield in which they had 5 targets, 5 catches, 44 yards, and a receiving touchdown. If the backup RB2 and RB3 are going to get themselves implemented within the receiving game, and we're going to ignore Breece Hall, his overall upside of opportunity is not enough within the rushing game to make him a consistent starting option every week for fantasy purposes, especially considering he has lacked touchdown upside. Taking on the Dolphins this week, one of the toughest matchups you could possibly ask for, only allowing 3.83 yards per carry on average. As of late, running backs have found success. Again, most recently, Green Bay 91 and 1 touchdown on the ground. But prior to that, New England 59 on the ground, Las Vegas 29. Breece Hall really, without touchdowns and receiving upside, going to be in trouble this week against Miami's defense. Moving on to our number 18, we have Aaron Jones, who himself has struggled as of late. He's fumbled the ball 4 times in the last 3 games, but not only that, has lost 2 of those fumbles. So if we're going to be in a situation in which he continues to put the ball on the ground, we're going to see a lot more Cam Akers or potentially Ty Chandler. And luckily, the offensive coaching staff specifically did not lean away from Aaron Jones entirely within this game. They eventually came back to him at the end of the game to score the game-winning touchdown. He could have scored a second receiving touchdown within the game. Unfortunately, he did drop that. Nonetheless, this week, hopefully he's going to get back on track. Hopefully getting himself a lot more opportunity coming off a week of only 5 rushing attempts for 22 rushing yards. With more exposure to opportunity, it will lead to more success, especially taking on the Falcons defense, who is allowing nearly 4.5 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs on the ground since week 6. Going into this week, the expectation is that the Minnesota Vikings should be leading this game for a majority of the contest, and in the event in which they are doing so, hopefully with a positive game script, find themselves handing off the ball to Aaron Jones 12 to 15 times this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 19, we have Najee Harris, who's coming off a fantastic performance, not only on the ground, but through the air. Look, on the ground, 75 yards and a touchdown is beautiful, but 6 receptions for 54 is absolutely out of nowhere. We didn't anticipate him to get himself that much success within the receiving game, but we'll take it. I mean, he's coming off of 6 consecutive games of 18-plus touches, coming off a performance most recently against the Cleveland Browns, who he has a privilege of taking on this week. Back in week 12 against them, 16 carries for 41, 2 catches for 13, only 6.4 fantasy points, has an opportunity of getting himself a little bit of revenge against the Browns, who defeated them last time out. So if we're going to be in a situation in which Najee Harris in this attack, who obviously looked incredible against the Cincinnati Bengals as of late, are going to continue their momentum, expect for Najee Harris to find success and hopefully continue to dominate the goal line opportunities within this offense. Moving on to our number 20 to close out the C tier, we have Isiah Pacheco taking on the Los Angeles Chargers. Look, Pacheco last week was limited in terms of overall snaps and touches, and hopefully that kind of limitation is going to be lifted within his overall potential, because taking on the Los Angeles Chargers is not an issue, especially considering they're allowing nearly 4.8 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. Most recent performances, Atlanta, 118 in a touchdown on the ground, Baltimore 195 in a touchdown, Cincinnati 86 on the ground, Tennessee 91 on the ground. If there's going to be a position in which Isiah Pacheco is back to getting himself 15 plus touches per game on the ground, expect for him to continue the success in which other teams have found, especially considering the Kansas City Chiefs have struggled within the passing game. They need to lean upon the running game in order to find success as an offense. Moving on to our number 21, we have Chuba Hubbard, who again got himself less opportunity this week than normal because there's a little bit more of an expansion of opportunity in touches and snaps for Jonathan Brooks. But going forward, it's not going to be at an extent to where we are worried about Chuba Hubbard. The only thing that purely worries me about Chuba Hubbard is if in fact this game gets out of hand. If the Philadelphia Eagles boat race them out of the building, the question then becomes, will Chuba Hubbard be given enough rushing opportunity within the upcoming script to be relevant? Coming off a week in which he had 0 targets and Jonathan Brooks primarily was the receiving back of the offense, if we're going to be in a situation in which Chuba Hubbard doesn't have that kind of volume of opportunity because of the script, taking on the defense that is only allowing 3.86 yards per carry on average and just most recently shut down Derrick Henry, if we're going to be in a situation like that, Chuba Hubbard could be a far lesser option within the upcoming contest. Moving on to our 22, we have Rachaad White, who again, he was given goal line opportunities. He had 2 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line, just unfortunately was not able to score. But the weeks prior, again, the 5 games prior, had scored 6 total touchdowns. So he has been given opportunity in the past. I'm not going to give up on the overall potential for upside from Rachaad White based on 1 week's of overall performance. Again, he's coming off a week in which he had 78 total yards on 12 touches. If he scores a touchdown, no one's complaining. And hopefully this week, he'll get himself those opportunities once again. Because again, Bucky Irving getting 25 plus touches, it's going to tire him out. And they're going to have to kind of use this backfield as a 2-headed monster and get Rachaad White the touches in order to give Bucky Irving those rest and breaks that he requires. So going into this week, again, with Rachaad White as of the last 3 games, averaging about 13.7 touches per game, while Bucky Irving is averaging about 20.7 touches per game throughout those last 3 games. As it all breaks down, if Rachaad White's going to get himself his 14 touches in a positive game script, hopefully a garbage time touchdown will be accompanying that performance within the upcoming week. Moving on to our number 23, we have Tyrone Tracy Jr. of the New York Giants. Again, Tyrone Tracy, as of late, has not been able to get himself a lot of opportunity on the ground, primarily because of the negative game scripts, most recently against the Dallas Cowboys and, of course, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Luckily, was able to steal himself a touchdown on the goal line, primarily because Drew Lock runs to the pylon, reaches over. They said he's out at the 1-yard line. Fantastic. Tyrone Tracy comes in and scores. If he doesn't get that touchdown, we're in trouble. Luckily, this week he takes on the Saints, allowing 5.46 yards per carry on average on the ground, over 21 fantasy points per game on the ground. It is the most advantageous matchup you can pretty much ask for. I mean, this defense has allowed 1 touchdown minimum in each of the last 6 games that they have played against opposing backfields. I'm expecting a negative game script, but hopefully Tyrone Tracy in the running game will be able to find success early enough within the upcoming contest. Moving on to our 24, we have Travis Etienne. This most recent performance against the Houston Texans, we saw a lot of opportunities going in the direction of Travis Etienne. Even though he only played 5 more snaps than Tank Bigsby, he had 16 touches in comparison to Bigsby 8 touches. So if we're going to be in a situation where Travis Etienne is going to be the clear and away RB1 of this offense, taking on the Tennessee Titans, the 12th best matchup at the position, we most recently saw what Brian Robinson, Jeremy McNichols, and Chris Rodriguez Jr. were all capable of accomplishing against this run-stop defense this most recent week for the Washington Commanders. Again, this defense is allowing over 15 fantasy points per game on the ground to opposing running backs. Therefore, I anticipate, with the vast majority of touches going in the direction of Travis Etienne, for him to continue to succeed in this category. Moving on to our number 25, we have DeAndre Swift. The fact of the matter is DeAndre Swift will always be plagued by the fact that even if they get down to the goal line, it is going to be the Roschon Johnson show. Now, the Bears offense this most recent week was scoreless in the first half. If they're going to have themselves a performance such as that, the running game is not going to be relevant. And the overall receiving utilization of DeAndre Swift has not been, quite frankly, potent enough to make him a top 24 option. Therefore, this week against the 49ers, despite the fact that it is the 4th best matchup, unless DeAndre Swift is to break out a huge run, I wouldn't expect much out of him considering his rushing touchdown upside is capped thus far. Moving on to our number 26, we have Jaylen Warren. Look, Jaylen Warren has been great, but this most recent game, we saw a lot of Cordero Patterson where we shouldn't have. But going into this week, hopefully we're going to get back on track, very similar in which he did in week 12 against the Cleveland Browns, can maybe accomplish that this week against the Cleveland Browns. 11 carries for 45 yards and a touchdown, 5 targets, 3 catches, 19 yards, and 13.9 fantasy points. That is what we're looking for. The Browns have allowed over 12 fantasy points per game on the ground to opposing running backs. Most recently, 97 on the ground and a touchdown to Denver Broncos running backs. Pittsburgh, 84 and a touchdown. Los Angeles Chargers, 92 and 2 touchdowns. Hopefully, Jaylen Warren is up for the task on hand and is going to be able to get himself enough opportunity. And hopefully, Cordero Patterson doesn't dig into his overall workload within the upcoming contest. Moving on to our number 27, we have Nick Chubb. Look, the fact of the matter is, outside of performances in which he's going to score a touchdown, it is highly difficult to trust in Nick Chubb in any sort of capacity. Again, there are going to be situations where he's going to catch a receiving touchdown for 5 yards, or he's going to be given the goal line attempt that is going to lead to a touchdown. Outside of those events, we are very much so in trouble. Now, this most recent performance against the Pittsburgh Steelers in a snow game, which obviously influenced the volume of touches he had, 20 carries for 59 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 18.5 fantasy points. The Steelers have not been a great run-stopping defense, so it will open up opportunity for Nick Chubb, but outside of scoring a touchdown, very much so worrisome this week. Moving on to our number 28, we have Gus Edwards, who again has a very difficult matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs. This defense allowing only 3.48 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. If we're going to be in a situation in which, of course, the Los Angeles Chargers have to abandon the running game because of the inefficiencies of Gus Edwards, Kamani Vidal, Hassan Haskins, etc., expect for Gus Edwards to completely disappear because he does not get himself any receiving utilization within the given week. Obviously, he ran the most routes amongst all the running backs within this offense, but only 1 target to show for it is not going to be able to sustain him for fantasy values. Outside of scoring a touchdown, Gus Edwards, a low-end RB3. Moving on to our number 29, we have Tank Bigsby, who again is the second fiddle of this backfield. Only 8 touches in comparison to Travis Etienne's 16 give us a clear understanding as to where this offense and this backfield is trending for the remainder of the season. As long as that is going to be the case, and Travis Etienne is the number 1, Tank Bigsby will only benefit mainly because of the fact that they have an advantageous matchup taking on the Tennessee Titans, who are allowing over 15 fantasy points per game, the 12th best matchup, and over 4.2 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. Moving on to our number 30. In the event in which Alexander Mattison is healthy and ready to play, I'm firing him up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Look, it's not that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are a great, overall matchup, but they are allowing 4.34 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs since week 6. Not only that, we have seen this offense specifically run the ball heavily with Ameer Abdullah and McCormick this most recent week that had himself 14 touches. If those kind of volume of opportunities are going to be sent in the direction of Alexander Mattison, who is also a capable receiving back, he should be a great option this week. Moving on to our number 31, Tyjae Spears, who's coming off of a week in which he had 14 snaps and 1 touch. I'm assuming that number is going to increase on both categories in terms of total snaps and touches. And when it does so, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, which is a top 5 matchup at the position in terms of fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs on the ground, in a potential positive game script, I would anticipate to see a lot more Tyjae Spears within the overall mix. Moving on to our number 32, Ameer Abdullah. Even when we trust Alexander Mattison to be relevant, I still expect Ameer Abdullah to get himself touches. This is a 2-headed backfield going forward, and Abdullah is going to be implicated within the rushing category and, of course, within the receiving category. So I'm not giving up on him as of yet. Again, if you are desperate enough with the Bipocalypse on hand, still a startable option. Moving on to our number 33, we have Kenneth Gainwell. Purely just a matter of, is he going to be given time late in the fourth quarter to collect garbage time yardage? If that's going to take place because of the efforts of Saquon Barkley and this offense throughout the first 3 quarters of the game, it would not surprise me if he finds success against the Carolina Panthers one-stop defense. Then we move on to Jamaal Williams, very similar. When we have Alvin Kamara dominating that run-stop defense, it should present opportunities for Jamaal Williams in the fourth quarter to come in and find himself his own individual success, which we have seen earlier this season in games in which they blow out defenses. Jamaal Williams comes in and gets himself about 10 touches in the fourth quarter to kill the clock. Then we move on to Ray Davis, very similar in garbage time against the LA Rams. If James Cook is able to find himself a healthy volume of success and the LA Rams offense is not able to function in the first half, expect for a lot of Ray Davis and James Cook in the mix in the second half of that game. And then our final running back is Zach Charbonnet, who over the course of the last 2 weeks has gotten goal line carries in this offense. Obviously one due to an injury, and most recently lining up as a fullback. Regardless of the overall situation, as long as they're using 2 back sets, as long as they're comfortable giving Zach Charbonnet these kind of opportunities, it may always lead to him yoinking a touchdown every week, which in this circumstance makes him a top 36 viable option, considering all of the options that we are missing in the running back position due to the bipocalypse. All right, outside of that, that's going to cover it in regards to my top 36 running back rankings for week 14. Again, I'll be back tomorrow talking about all things wide receiver with our top 36 wide receiver rankings. I'll be back later tonight starting at 7 p.m. PST. If you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. Outside of that, have a great rest of your day, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.